I never thought I'd be the kind of person to break into my own father's basement. But there I was at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night in November, holding a crowbar like it was going to save my life. My name is Caleb Thornfield, and up until 3 hours ago, I thought my dad was just another retired steelworker from Pittsburgh South Side. 42 years at Allegheny Steelworks, gold watch, pension, the whole American dream wrapped up in flannel shirts and pirate season tickets. But then I found the envelope. It was sitting on my kitchen counter when I got home from my shift at the electrical plant. No postmark, no return address, just my name written in block letters that looked like they were carved with rage. Inside, a single photograph and an address. The photograph showed my father, 20 years younger, wearing a suit I'd never seen, shaking hands with a man in front of what looked like a military installation. But it wasn't the handshake that made my blood run cold. It was what I could see in the background, rows upon rows of missiles, each one stamped with the Allegheny Steelworks logo. The address led me here, to the house I grew up in, to the basement I'd been forbidden to enter my entire life. Just old junk down there, son, Dad would always say whenever I asked. Nothing but rust and regret. I should have listened. The stairs groaned under my weight like they were trying to warn me. Each step felt like a betrayal, not just of my father's trust, but of everything I thought I knew about the man who taught me to ride a bike, who came to every Little League game, who cried at my wedding. The basement was nothing like I'd imagined. Instead of the dusty storage room I expected, I found myself in what could only be described as an office. Not just any office, a war room. Maps covered every wall, marked with red pins and connected by string like something out of a conspiracy thriller. But these weren't random locations. I recognized them: steel plants, manufacturing facilities, military bases. All connected by a single company name, Allegheny Steelworks. The filing cabinets were unlocked. Either my father was getting careless in his old age, or he wanted someone to find us. 3 hours later, surrounded by documents that made my hands shake, I was starting to suspect the latter. Contract after contract, each one more damning than the last. Allegheny Steelworks hadn't just been making I-beams and construction materials. For over 3 decades, they'd been the primary supplier of weapons-grade steel to defense contractors around the world. Not just American contracts, foreign ones too. Countries we'd supposedly been at peace with. Countries we'd definitely been at war with. And every single contract bore 2 signatures, the Allegheny CEO and my father's name as Quality Assurance Director. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the folder labeled Special Projects Eyes Only. Inside that folder, I found blueprints. Not for buildings or bridges, but for weapons. Detailed schematics for artillery shells, tank armor, missile casings. Each blueprint was annotated in my father's handwriting, his neat, careful script that I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists my entire life. But now those same hands had written things like increased shrapnel dispersion and optimized penetration capacity in field test results, satisfactory civilian impact. Civilian impact. I dropped the folder. Papers scattered across the concrete floor like leaves, each one a testament to a life I'd never known my father had lived. A life where quality assurance meant ensuring that weapons killed as efficiently as possible. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those blueprints. I heard my father's voice saying civilian impact like he was discussing the weather. By 6 a.m., I was sitting at my kitchen table, waiting. Dad always showed up on Wednesday mornings for coffee and yesterday's news. Our ritual for the past 5 years, ever since Mom died. He'd bring donuts from Permontes, I'd make the coffee too strong, and we'd argue about the Steelers' chances this season. Normal, safe, built on a foundation of lies. Morning, son. Hope you got the good coffee going. It's cold enough out there to freeze a penguin's. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw my face. Maybe it was the way I was sitting perfectly still, hands folded like I was conducting an interview. Maybe it was the manila envelope sitting between us on the table. Or maybe it was the fact that I looked like I'd aged 10 years overnight. "You found it," he said. Not a question, a statement. Like he'd been expecting this moment for 30 years. "Found what, Dad?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Found out that my father spent 4 decades helping kill people? Found out that my father spent 4 decades helping kill people? Found out that every story you told me about honest work and American values was a lie? Which part did I find?" He sat down slowly, like his bones were made of the same steel he'd spent his life perfecting. When he looked up, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, shame so deep it had carved lines in his face. "It wasn't supposed to be like that," he said. "Then how was it supposed to be?" "I was 23 years old, Caleb. Fresh out of technical school, married to your mother, with a baby on the way. Allegheny offered me more money than I'd ever seen. Said I'd be doing my patriotic duty, helping America stay strong. Then the foreign contracts, the countries we were fighting." His hands trembled as he reached for the envelope. "That came later. Much later. By then, I was in too deep. Had a mortgage. You were in Little League. Needed braces. Your mother wanted that addition to the house. I told myself I was just checking quality. Just making sure the steel was strong. Strong enough to kill efficiently. I never asked what they used it for. Not directly. I just checked the specifications. Made sure it met requirements. It was just numbers on paper, son. Just mathematics. Mathematics that blew up schools. Mathematics that tore through hospital walls. Mathematics that turned children into statistics." The words hung between us like smoke. For the first time in my life, I watched my father break down. Not the quiet tears he'd shed at Mom's funeral, but something deeper. Something that seemed to come from the very core of who he was. "I know," he whispered. "God help me, I know." We moved to the living room, where the ghosts of our better relationship seemed to watch from picture frames. Me in my high school graduation cap. Dad and me at a Steelers game. The three of us, Mom included, at Christmas morning, faces bright with the kind of joy that seemed impossible now. "Why did you keep all those documents?" I asked. "Insurance," he said, "and evidence. I always told myself that someday, when I was old enough, or brave enough, or desperate enough, I'd find a way to make it right. Turn over everything to the authorities, accept whatever punishment was coming. But you never did." "No, I never did. And every year it got harder. Every birthday party you threw, every time you said you were proud of me, every time you introduced me to your friends as your hero dad who helped build America. How do you destroy that? How do you tell your son that his hero is a war criminal?" The photo on the mantle showed us at my 8th birthday party. Dad was wearing his work clothes, the same flannel shirt and steel-toed boots that had become his uniform. I was grinning at the camera, holding up a toy crane he brought me from the plant. "You helped build America, all right," I said. "You just built the parts that destroy other countries." "I know what I am, Caleb. I've known for 30 years. But I'm also the man who taught you to throw a curveball. I'm the man who stayed up all night when you had pneumonia. I'm the man who walked you down the aisle at your wedding. And you're the man who helped perfect the steel that killed thousands of people." "Yes, I'm that too." We sat there for what felt like hours, two men who'd suddenly become strangers to each other. The afternoon light shifted across the room, illuminating different photos at different times, a lifetime of memories now contaminated by truth. "What happens now?" I asked finally. "That depends on you, son. You could turn over everything to the FBI, send your old man to prison for whatever years I have left. Or you could put it all back in that basement and pretend you never saw it. Those are my only choices: destroy you or become complicit. Sometimes those are the only choices we get." But even as he said it, I could see in his eyes that he knew there was a third option, the one that had been growing in my mind since I first opened that envelope, the one that would change everything but might actually accomplish something. The one that would require me to become someone I never thought I could be. I left Dad's house that evening with more questions than answers, but with something I hadn't expected, a plan. Not a good plan, maybe not even a sane plan, but a plan nonetheless. If my father had spent 40 years perfecting weapons that killed people, maybe I could spend whatever time I had left making sure those weapons were never perfect again. The next morning, I called in sick to work. Not entirely a lie, I felt like I'd been poisoned, infected by knowledge I could never unknow. Instead of my usual shift at the electrical plant, I drove to the Pittsburgh Public Library and spent 6 hours researching everything I could find about Allegheny Steel Works, its current operations, and its client list. What I found made my father's basement look like child's play. Allegheny had gone international in a big way. No longer content with just supplying American defense contractors, they'd become a major player in what the defense industry politely called global security solutions. Their steel was being used in weapon systems sold to literally dozens of countries, many of whom were using those weapons against their own people. But here's what made my blood run cold. They were expanding. A new facility was under construction in Hazelwood, one of Pittsburgh's old steel neighborhoods. According to the corporate press releases, it would be their most advanced manufacturing plant yet, capable of producing next-generation metallurgy solutions for emerging defense applications. Translation: better ways to kill people more efficiently. The facility was scheduled to open in 6 months. Production would begin immediately, with the first major contracts going to 3 countries currently engaged in what the UN diplomatically termed internal conflicts. Civil wars, genocides, mass killings that would be powered by Pittsburgh steel, quality assured by techniques my father had perfected. I drove to the construction site that afternoon. It was massive, easily 10 times the size of any manufacturing facility I'd ever seen. Cranes stretched into the sky like mechanical prayers, lifting steel beams that would soon form the skeleton of America's newest death factory. The irony wasn't lost on me. Those beams were probably made from Allegheny steel, too. Standing there, watching workers build what would become a monument to profitable violence, I realized something that should have terrified me but instead filled me with a strange calm. I was going to stop this. Not through legal channels, not through congressional hearings or investigative journalism, or any of the proper ways citizens were supposed to address corporate evil. I was going to stop it the way problems like this had always been stopped, back when Americans still believed in personal responsibility over systemic solutions. I was going to sabotage it, but I couldn't do it alone. What I needed was someone with access, someone with skills, and someone with enough anger to match my own. I found all 3 in Tommy Kowalski. Tommy and I had grown up 3 blocks apart, played on the same Little League team, graduated high school the same year. While I'd gone to community college and learned about electrical systems, Tommy had followed his father into steelworking. He'd spent 15 years at various Pittsburgh plants, watching jobs disappear overseas and communities die while corporate executives bought their 3rd vacation homes. More importantly, Tommy currently worked at the Hazelwood construction site, night security. "You want to do what?" Tommy asked after I'd laid out my plan over our 3rd beer at Mickey's Tavern. "I want to make sure that plant never opens. Or if it does open, that everything it produces fails catastrophically when it's needed most." "Cal, that's terrorism, man." "No, Tommy. Terrorism is selling weapons to governments that use them to murder children. What I'm talking about is quality control." I pulled out a folder I'd prepared, not one of Dad's classified documents, but public records I'd compiled at the library. Newspaper articles about villages destroyed by weapons that could be traced back to Allegheny Steel. Photos of hospitals bombed with artillery shells that bore the company's metallurgy signature. UN reports documenting massacres committed with small arms that relied on Pittsburgh-forged components. "Look at this," I said, spreading the papers across our small table. "Really look at it. Every one of these stories connects back to your current employer. Every dead child in these photos was killed by steel that someone in this city helped perfect. Tommy studied the documents with the same careful attention he'd once brought to Little League statistics. I watched his face change as the reality sank in. This wasn't abstract corporate evil anymore. It was specific, documented, measurable evil happening in his own backyard. What exactly are you asking me to do? Give me access. Show me the security rotations, the construction schedules, the delivery timetables. Help me understand how that facility works so I can make sure it doesn't work. And if we get caught, then we go to prison. But if we don't act, thousands of people die, and we have to live with knowing we could have prevented it. Tommy was quiet for a long time, staring into his beer like it might contain answers. When he finally looked up, I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of my father's expression that morning, the look of a man who'd been carrying weight he didn't know how to put down. My dad worked at J&L Steel for 38 years, he said. Every morning, he put on his hard hat and go build America. That's what he told me. Tommy, we're building America. Every beam, every plate, every rivet, it's going to hold up something important someday. What happened to him? Plant closed in '97. Dad never worked again. Died 5 years later, still believing he'd been building something good. I've been trying to honor that belief my whole life, you know? Trying to believe that working with steel meant something noble. He pushed one of the newspaper clippings toward me, a story about a school in Syria that had been destroyed by artillery fire. But this isn't noble, is it? This is just profitable. Yeah, it's just profitable. Tommy finished his beer and set the bottle down with the kind of finality that ends conversations and begins conspiracies. When do we start? Over the next 3 weeks, Tommy gave me a graduate-level education in industrial sabotage. Not intentionally, he was just showing me how the facility was being built, but every piece of information revealed new opportunities for disruption. The Hazelwood plant was designed around a central furnace system that would heat-treat steel to exact specifications. Temperature control was everything, too hot or too cold, and the metallurgy would be compromised in ways that might not be detected until the weapons failed in the field. See these sensors? Tommy pointed to a series of electronic devices being installed along the furnace walls. They monitor temperature down to individual degrees. Computer system adjusts heat levels automatically based on what's being produced. What happens if the sensors give wrong readings? Depends how wrong. A few degrees off, you get steel that's slightly weaker than spec. 20 degrees off, you get steel that looks perfect but fails under stress. 50 degrees off. Yeah. 50 degrees off, you get expensive scrap metal. Looks good, tests good in the lab, but falls apart the first time someone actually tries to use it. I spent those 3 weeks learning everything I could about modern steel production, how computer systems controlled every aspect of manufacturing, how quality control was now automated, with human oversight reduced to monitoring screens and interpreting data, how the entire process depended on the accuracy of electronic sensors that could be manipulated by someone who understood electrical systems. Someone like me. But the more I learned, the more I realized we were planning something far bigger than simple sabotage. If we succeeded, if we could compromise the computerized control systems without detection, we wouldn't just be shutting down one plant. We'd be creating a situation where every piece of steel that plant produced would be fundamentally unreliable. Weapons that would misfire, armor that would crack under pressure, artillery shells that would explode prematurely, tank components that would fail at critical moments. And because the flaws would be built into the metallurgy itself, they wouldn't be discovered until those weapons were actually used in combat. You realize what this means, don't you? I asked Tommy during one of our late-night reconnaissance sessions. It means a lot of military equipment is going to malfunction. It means soldiers are going to die, Tommy. Not just the people they're trying to kill, but the soldiers using the weapons. American soldiers, in some cases. Tommy stopped walking. We were standing in the shadow of the main furnace assembly, a structure that would soon be producing death on an industrial scale. "So we don't do it?" he asked. "I don't know. I thought I knew, but now, how do we choose who lives and who dies? How do we decide that Syrian children matter more than American soldiers?" "Maybe we don't decide," Tommy said. "Maybe we just make sure the weapons don't work for anybody. Level the playing field. Let people settle their differences some other way." People have been settling differences with violence for thousands of years, Tommy. You think faulty steel is going to change human nature? No, but maybe it'll change the math. Maybe if weapons can't be trusted, there'll be more incentive to find other solutions. We stood there in the darkness, two men trying to convince ourselves that we were heroes instead of terrorists, that our plan would save lives instead of just redistributing death, that we had the right to make decisions that would affect thousands of people we'd never meet. The truth was, we didn't know what we were doing. We were just two guys from Pittsburgh who'd stumbled onto something too big for us to fully understand, armed with good intentions and no clear path forward. But sometimes, that's enough to change the world. I started bringing Tommy to Dad's house. Not because I wanted to expand our conspiracy, but because I needed him to understand the full scope of what Allegheny had been doing for decades. The Hazelwood plant wasn't an aberration. It was the next evolution of a business model that had been perfecting violence for longer than either of us had been alive. "Jesus Christ," Tommy whispered, flipping through contract after contract. "How long has this been going on?" "Since at least the early 80s, maybe longer." "And your dad, he knew all of this? He helped create all of this?" That's when Dad came downstairs. I've been expecting it, honestly. For 3 weeks, he'd been watching me leave the house at strange hours, come back covered in construction dust, spend entire evenings in his basement with files he'd never meant for anyone else to see. He wasn't stupid. He knew what was happening. "You must be Tommy," Dad said, not sounding particularly surprised to find a stranger reading classified defense contracts in his basement. "Mr. Thornfield," Tommy replied, standing up like he'd been caught doing something shameful instead of trying to prevent atrocities. "Sit down, son. If you're reading those files, we're all in this together now." What followed was the strangest conversation of my life. My father, the man who'd spent 40 years perfecting weapons, calmly discussing sabotage plans with his son and a steelworker he'd met 5 minutes earlier. Not arguing against what we were planning, not trying to talk us out of it, but actually improving our strategy. "The sensors are the weak point," Dad said, studying Tommy's sketches of the furnace control system. "But if you just sabotage them randomly, someone will notice the pattern. What you need is selective failure, problems that look like normal industrial accidents." "How?" I asked. "You don't break the sensors. You reprogram them. Make them report accurate temperatures 90% of the time, but give false readings for specific alloy compositions, the ones used in weapons applications." Dad pulled out a file I hadn't seen before. Technical specifications for different steel grades, each one marked with its intended military applications. "See this? Grade 47 alpha steel, used primarily in artillery shells. Very specific heat treatment requirements. If the furnace runs 15 degrees too hot during the initial heating phase, the steel becomes brittle at the molecular level. Won't show up in standard testing, but the shells will fragment prematurely when fired." "Killing the gunners instead of the targets," Tommy said. "Exactly. Grade 23 Charlie, used in tank armor 12 degrees too cold during cooling, and it loses structural integrity under impact. Grade 56 Delta, missile casings, temperature fluctuations during the intermediate phase create microfractures that cause catastrophic failure during launch." I stared at my father, this man I'd known my entire life, casually explaining how to turn his life's work into a weapon against itself. "Why are you helping us?" I asked. "Because you're going to do this whether I help or not. And if you're going to do it, you might as well do it right." That's not an answer. Dad was quiet for a long moment, looking at the documents scattered around us, the accumulated evidence of his professional life, now being used to plan its undoing. I'm 73 years old, Caleb. I've got lung cancer from 40 years of breathing steel dust, and the doctors say I've got maybe 18 months left. I can spend that time in prison, or I can spend it trying to undo some of the damage I've done. The cancer, you never said. Diagnosis came the same day you found that envelope. Funny how timing works sometime. Tell me clear this through. Mr. Thornfield, with all due respect, how do we know this isn't some kind of trap? How do we know you're not going to turn us in? Dad smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from him since this whole thing started. Son, I've been waiting 30 years for someone to punish me for what I've done. If I wanted to turn myself in, I'd have done it decades ago. What I want now is to make sure that when I die, I don't take thousands of other people with me. And that's how it started. Not with grand speeches about justice or democracy or moral obligation, but with a dying man trying to buy back his soul, his son trying to live with knowledge that was killing him, and a steelworker trying to honor his father's memory by betraying everything his father had believed in. 3 men in a basement, surrounded by the blueprints of past atrocities, planning to commit crimes that might save lives. It should have felt heroic. Instead, it felt like folly. But that's when we discovered we weren't the only ones playing this game. Tommy came to us 3 days later with information that changed everything. During his security rounds, he'd overheard a conversation between 2 Allegheny executives, a conversation that made our sabotage plans look like amateur hour. They know, Tommy said, settling into what had become his usual chair in Dad's basement war room. Know what? I asked. They know the steel is going to fail. Not because of anything we're planning to do, but because they're designing it to fail. According to what Tommy had overheard, Allegheny wasn't just selling weapons-grade steel to foreign governments. They were selling planned obsolescence, steel that would perform perfectly for a predetermined period long enough to pass all initial testing and get through the first few months of deployment, then fail catastrophically. It's insurance, Tommy explained. They sell weapons to both sides of a conflict, but they make sure neither side can maintain a decisive advantage for long. Weapons fail at strategic moments, forcing both sides to keep buying replacements. That's... I started, then stopped. There wasn't a word for what that was. That's business, Dad said flatly. Evil, brilliant, and completely legal business. The documents Tommy had managed to photograph showed the scope of what Allegheny was really doing. It wasn't just about selling weapons, it was about managing conflicts, prolonging wars just enough to maximize profit while preventing any one side from achieving total victory. They had contracts with governments that were actively fighting each other. They had timetables for when specific weapon systems would begin failing. They had contingency plans for redirecting sales when conflicts ended too quickly. And they had lists of regions they considered optimal conflict zones, lists of governments they classified as sustainable purchasers, lists of projected casualty rates that they used to calculate market demand. Look at this, Dad said, pointing to a spreadsheet that made my stomach turn. They're not just predicting deaths, they're budgeting for them. Each casualty represents a certain amount of replacement equipment sales. Syria, 47,000 projected deaths over 18 months, estimated replacement value $340 million. Yemen, 23,000 projected deaths over 12 months, estimated replacement value $180 million. Myanmar, 12,000 projected deaths over 8 months, estimated replacement value $95 million. Human lives reduced to market projections. Death as a sustainable business model. We're not just fighting a company, I realized. We're fighting a system. An entire economic structure built on keeping people killing each other efficiently, but not decisively. So what do we do? Tommy asked. We adapt, Dad said. If they want their steel to fail on schedule, we make sure it fails off schedule. If they want controlled obsolescence, we give them chaos. But even as we refined our plans, I could feel something shifting in the dynamic between the three of us. Dad was getting sicker. I could see it in the way he moved, the way he paused sometimes in the middle of sentences like he was conserving energy. Tommy was getting angrier, spending hours staring at casualty projections, like he was memorizing the names of people he'd never meet but felt responsible for protecting. And me? I was getting scared. Not of getting caught, not of going to prison, but of what we were becoming. We'd started as would-be saboteurs trying to prevent atrocities. Now we were strategic planners trying to disrupt a global system of managed violence. There's something else, Tommy said, pulling out one more document. Something that changes everything. The document was a timeline, not for steel production or weapons delivery, but for facility expansion. Allegheny wasn't just building the Hazelwood plant. They were planning 12 more facilities across the United States, each one designed to serve specific regional conflicts, each one equipped with the same planned obsolescence technology we discovered. They're industrializing war, Dad said, turning it into a renewable resource. And that's when I realized the truth that should have been obvious from the beginning. We weren't trying to stop a crime. We were trying to stop the evolution of civilization itself, the point where human conflict became just another market sector optimized for sustainable profitability. The scariest part wasn't that they might succeed. The scariest part was that they already had. 6 months later, the Hazelwood plant opened on schedule. Ribbons were cut, speeches were made, and the first batch of grade 47 alpha steel rolled off the production line exactly as planned. Our sabotage had worked perfectly. Which is why I was standing in my kitchen at 3 a.m., staring at a news report that made me question everything we'd done. Breaking news from overseas, a Syrian artillery unit experienced what military officials are calling a catastrophic equipment failure during routine training exercises. 7 soldiers were killed and 12 injured when multiple artillery shells exploded prematurely. The Syrian Defense Ministry is investigating the cause of the malfunction, but early reports suggest defective ammunition may be responsible. Syrian soldiers. Not Syrian civilians being targeted by those artillery shells, but Syrian soldiers using weapons that we had deliberately sabotaged. I turned off the television and called Tom. "Did you see the news?" I asked when he answered. "Yeah, I saw it. Those were our guys, Tommy. Those soldiers died because of what we did." "I know. Do you regret it?" "I don't know. Do you?" I didn't answer because I didn't have an answer. 7 dead soldiers versus how many dead civilians if those artillery shells had worked as designed? How do you calculate that kind of mathematics? How do you weigh lives you've taken against lives you might have saved? "There's something else," Tommy said. "Something you need to know." "What?" "The Syrian artillery unit that got hit? They weren't preparing for combat operations. They were training to defend a refugee camp." That's when the unraveling really began. Over the next month, reports of weapons failures began appearing from around the world. Artillery shells exploding prematurely in Pakistan, but during a training exercise to protect a hydroelectric dam from terrorists. Tank armor failing in Yemen, but on vehicles being used to evacuate civilians from a combat zone. Missile guidance systems malfunctioning in Myanmar, but during a mission to intercept drug smugglers. Every failure we'd engineered to prevent atrocities was instead causing different atrocities. We didn't think it through, I told Dad during one of our increasingly desperate strategy sessions. We assumed we knew who the good guys and bad guys were, but real conflicts aren't that simple. "No conflict is that simple," Dad replied. He was getting weaker. The cancer was progressing faster than the doctors had predicted. Some days he could barely make it down to the basement, but he insisted on continuing our work. That's what took me 40 years to understand. Every weapon I helped perfect, I told myself it would be used by the right people against the wrong people. But there are no right people, Caleb. There are just people trying to survive in a world that profits from their deaths. But the worst part wasn't the moral complexity of what we'd done. The worst part was that it didn't matter.
3 weeks after the first weapons failures started making international news, Tommy brought us a new set of documents. Not stolen this time, handed to him directly by his supervisor at the construction site.
"They want to promote me," he said, his voice hollow. "Security supervisor for the entire northeastern region. Apparently, my attention to detail during the Hazelwood construction impressed corporate management." "What kind of attention to detail?" I asked, though I was starting to suspect I already knew. "The kind where they noticed that someone had been accessing restricted areas during my shifts. The kind where they installed hidden cameras and recorded everything we did." They'd known. From the beginning, Allegheny had known exactly what we were doing. Our careful planning, our months of reconnaissance, our supposedly sophisticated sabotage, it had all been theater performed for an audience that was writing the script. "How long?" Dad asked.
According to the documents they showed me, since the second week, they let us proceed because our sabotage actually improved their business model.
Photos were all there. Me entering the facility with Tommy, Dad providing technical specifications in his basement, all of us working together to create what we thought was sophisticated sabotage, but what Allegheny's board of directors had classified as market optimization through controlled failure rates. We hadn't been disrupting their planned obsolescence strategy. We'd been perfecting it.
They wanted unpredictable failure patterns, Tommy continued, reading from corporate memos that treated our sabotage like a consulting service. Random enough to seem like manufacturing defects, sophisticated enough to avoid detection, and morally motivated enough to be sustained long-term without requiring direct corporate involvement.
"We've been working for them," I said. "We've been working for them the entire time." That's when they invited us to a meeting. Not arrested us, not exposed us. Invited us to a formal business meeting at Allegheny Steelworks corporate headquarters, complete with parking passes and visitor badges. The conference room was everything you'd expect from a defense contractor that had spent decades optimizing violence for profit. Polished table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the three rivers that had once powered Pittsburgh's honest steel industry.
The presentation began with a PowerPoint slide titled "Sustainable Conflict Management, a New Paradigm for Defense Industry Growth."
"Gentlemen," said Victoria Ashford, Allegheny's Senior Vice President of Strategic Development, "thank you for your innovative contributions to our research and development process. Your work over the past 6 months has exceeded our most optimistic projections."
She clicked to the next slide, profit margins that had increased by 340% since our sabotage had begun. Traditional planned obsolescence required us to engineer failure points that could be detected and potentially reversed by hostile intelligence services. Your approach, sabotage motivated by genuine moral conviction, creates failure patterns that appear completely random while actually serving our strategic interests.
The data was undeniable. Every weapons failure we caused had led to increased sales. Every premature explosion had created demand for replacement ammunition. Every structural failure had generated contracts for improved armor systems. But more than that, our failures had created something Allegheny had never been able to achieve through traditional planned obsolescence: plausible deniability. When weapons fail due to manufacturing defects, customers demand refunds or sue for damages, Ashford explained. When weapons fail due to sabotage by moral actors, customers assume they're being targeted by enemy intelligence services and increase their security budgets accordingly. Tommy leaned forward in his chair. "You're saying you want us to keep sabotaging your products?"
"We're saying we want to offer you employment. Full-time positions with competitive salaries, comprehensive benefits, and the satisfaction of knowing that your work is making the world a safer place." The employment contracts were already prepared. Director of Quality Assurance Disruption for me, Senior Field Operations Coordinator for Tommy, Special Consultant for Metallurgical Warfare Applications for Dad.
"What if we refuse?" I asked.
Then you continue your current activities as private citizens, and we continue to benefit from them while taking no responsibility for the consequences. The only difference is that you won't receive compensation for work you're already doing. That's when I understood the true scope of what we were facing. This wasn't a company or even an industry. It was a system so perfectly designed that resistance became collaboration, that moral action became market optimization, that the very attempt to fight evil became a form of evil itself.
You planned this from the beginning, Dad said.
Not planned, exactly. But we've been in business long enough to recognize patterns. Every few years, someone discovers what we do and tries to stop us. Sometimes it's journalists, sometimes it's activists, sometimes it's employees who develop a conscience. The pattern is always the same: moral outrage, followed by sabotage attempts, followed by unintended consequences that ultimately serve our interests.
And those people, what happens to them?
They either join us or they spend the rest of their lives dealing with the psychological consequences of having made the problem worse while trying to make it better.
The slides showed faces I didn't recognize, but stories I understood completely.
Engineers who tried to build fail-safes into weapon systems, only to see those fail-safes turned into features that made the weapons more profitable. Accountants who tried to expose financial irregularities, only to see their disclosures spun as evidence of the company's commitment to transparency. Military officers who tried to report war crimes, only to see their reports used as market research for developing more effective weapons. The beauty of the system, Ashford continued, is that it's completely self-sustaining. The more people try to fight it, the stronger it becomes. The more atrocities it commits, the more demand it creates for its own products. The more it's exposed, the more legitimacy it gains by appearing to cooperate with oversight.
So what are you? Tommy asked.
What kind of people build something like this? We're the same kind of people you are, Ashford replied. People who want to make the world better. The difference is that we've accepted the reality that better is relative, that conflict is inevitable, and that someone is going to profit from human violence regardless of our moral qualms. We've simply chosen to make sure that someone is us, and that we do it as efficiently as possible. We left that meeting with unsigned contracts and a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Continue our sabotage and remain complicit in a system that had turned our rebellion into a business model, or stop our sabotage and watch that same system continue without us. There has to be a third option, Tommy said as we stood in the parking garage, holding documents that formalized our complete moral failure.
Like what? I asked.
I don't know. Go public? Tell the media what we've learned? And saying what? That we've been sabotaging weapons that were designed to fail anyway? That we've been working for a company that's been manipulating us from the beginning? That we've killed soldiers while trying to save civilians? Dad leaned against his car, the oxygen tank he now needed making him look smaller and freelier than I'd ever seen him. There is no third option, son. That's what I spent 40 years learning. The system doesn't allow for third options.
So we just give up?
We accept reality. We sign the contracts, we take the money, and we try to minimize the damage from inside the system instead of making it worse from outside. That's what you told yourself for 40 years. And I was right. Look what happened when I tried to fight it. Look what happened when you tried to fight it. We made everything worse. But that's not the end of the story. That's just the end of the part where we thought we were heroes. 6 weeks later, I reported for my first day of work as Allegheny Steelworks Director of Quality Assurance Disruption. Tommy started the same day as Senior Field Operations Coordinator. Dad's position was purely consultative. The cancer had progressed to the point where he could barely leave the house, but his 40 years of experience made him invaluable for training new employees in what the company politely called controlled failure methodologies. My office had a window overlooking the Hazelwood facility. Every morning, I could watch trucks loaded with steel that I had personally sabotaged driving away to destinations I tried not to think about. Every afternoon, I received reports on the performance metrics of our products. Casualty rates, replacement orders, customer satisfaction surveys from governments that were using our defective weapons to kill their own people more inefficiently than they'd planned. The work was exactly what you'd expect. I analyzed failure patterns to ensure they remained random enough to avoid detection, but predictable enough to maintain customer dependency. I coordinated with field operatives who collected data on how our sabotage weapons performed in actual combat. I attended meetings where we discussed optimization strategies for different types of conflicts. It was professional, efficient, and completely evil. But here's what I hadn't expected. It was also boring. Evil, it turns out, is mostly spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations and quarterly performance reviews. It's cost-benefit analyses and market research and strategic planning sessions. It's a job you show up to every morning, perform competently, and then go home to eat dinner with your family. How do you do it? I asked Ashford during one of our monthly planning meetings. How do you come to work every day knowing what we're really doing? The same way anyone does any job, she replied. I focus on the parts I can control and try not to think too much about the bigger picture. I'm good at logistics, I'm good at managing complex systems, and I'm good at solving problems. The fact that those problems involve optimizing human suffering is just context. Doesn't it bother you? Of course it bothers me. But being bothered doesn't change anything. And at least when I'm managing the suffering, I can make sure it's managed efficiently. That became my life. 8 hours a day optimizing atrocities, then going home to a house I could finally afford thanks to my salary increase, eating dinner while watching news reports about conflicts I was helping to perpetuate, falling asleep to the sound of my own rationalizations. Tommy adapted better than I did. His job required more travel, field research, and active conflict zones, which meant he spent most of his time seeing the results of our work firsthand. Somehow, witnessing the consequences directly made it easier for him to accept his role in causing them. It's not that I don't feel guilty, he told me during one of his brief returns to Pittsburgh. It's that I've stopped believing guilt matters. Feeling bad about something doesn't make it less real, and it doesn't help the people who are suffering because of what we do. So you just don't feel anything? I feel everything, but I've learned to feel it without letting it change my behavior. Because changing my behavior won't help anyone. Dad lasted 8 months in his consulting role before the cancer finally won. I spent his last week in the hospital with him, watching machines keep him alive while he used whatever energy he had left to brief me on projects I'd be inheriting. The Myanmar contract is coming up for renewal, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ventilator. They're requesting modifications to the grade 23 Charlie specifications. 15% failure rate instead of 20%. They want their tank armor to last longer. Dad, you don't need to worry about work right now. This is all I have left, son. These numbers, these specifications, they're the only thing I know how to do. Even dying, he couldn't stop being what he'd become. 40 years of optimizing weapons had turned him into a machine that could only function by calculating death. Do you regret it? I asked him on what turned out to be his last night. Any of it? He was quiet for so long, I thought he'd fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, clearer somehow, like the morphine had stripped away everything except the essential truth he'd been carrying for decades. I regret that it took me so long to understand what I was really doing. I regret that I spent so many years telling myself I was just following orders, just doing my job, just trying to provide for my family. But do I regret the work itself? Yeah? No, because someone was going to do it whether I did or not. At least when I did it, I tried to do it competently. I tried to make sure the weapons worked the way they were supposed to work, even if what they were supposed to do was kill people. That's not much of a legacy. It's the only legacy any of us get, son. We do the jobs we're given as well as we can, and we try not to think too much about whether those jobs should exist in the first place. He died at 4:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March. The same day, Myanmar accepted the contract renewal with modified specifications that would make their tank armor slightly more reliable, slightly more effective at protecting soldiers who were using those tanks to commit genocide. His funeral was well attended. Allegheny sent flowers and a representative who gave a speech about Dad's dedication to excellence in metallurgical applications. Former co-workers shared stories about his attention to detail, his willingness to work overtime, his pride in American manufacturing. Nobody mentioned that his excellence had been applied to perfecting instruments of mass murder. Nobody talked about the attention to detail that had optimized killing efficiency. Nobody acknowledged that his pride in American manufacturing had powered conflicts on 6 continents. Standing at his graveside, listening to people praise a man whose life's work had contributed to countless deaths, I finally understood what he'd been trying to tell me. We don't get to choose whether evil systems exist. We only get to choose our role in them. A year after Dad's death, I was promoted to Senior Director of Strategic Quality Management. Tommy became Regional Coordinator for Global Operations. We both received raises, better benefits, and recognition for our innovative approaches to product optimization. The Hazelwood facility was now operating at full capacity, producing steel for conflicts in 17 countries. Our sabotage techniques had been refined into standard operating procedures. What had started as moral rebellion had become corporate policy. I spent my days training new employees in quality management disruption. Most of them were recent engineering graduates who thought they were learning advanced manufacturing techniques. A few were moral actors like we'd been, people who discovered what Allegheny really did and tried to fight it, only to find themselves recruited into the system they'd attempted to destroy. The key to effective disruption, I would tell them during training sessions, is understanding that our goal isn't to prevent weapons from working. Our goal is to ensure they work exactly as long as our customers need them to work, and fail exactly when replacement sales become necessary. Some of them asked the same questions I'd asked, about morality, about consequences, about whether there might be better ways to make a living. I gave them the same answers I've been given. That someone would do this work whether they did it or not. That at least when competent people did it, it was done efficiently. That feeling guilty about necessary work didn't help anyone. Most of them accepted these answers because the alternative, acknowledging that they were participating in industrialized atrocity, was too psychologically expensive to sustain. But sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I would think about the Syrian artillery unit that had been destroyed by shells we'd sabotaged. 7 soldiers who died because 3 men in Pittsburgh had decided they knew better than the global arms industry about how weapons should work. I would think about the refugee camps those soldiers have been training to protect, about the families who might have lived if those artillery shells had worked as designed, about the complex mathematics of moral action in a world where every choice led to someone's death. And I would remind myself that thinking about these things was a luxury I could no longer afford. I had a job to do, a mortgage to pay, and a role to play in a system that would continue operating whether I participated enthusiastically or spent my time questioning its existence. Tommy and I still met occasionally, usually at the same bar where we first planned our sabotage. We didn't talk about work much. What was there to say? We'd both become exactly what we'd once tried to fight, and we both understood that this transformation was irreversible. "Do you ever think about quitting?" Tommy asked during one of these meetings. "Every day. Do you?" "Yeah. But then I think about who they'd hire to replace me, and I realize that at least I understand what we're really doing. At least I've seen the consequences firsthand. Someone new might be more enthusiastic about it. So we stay to minimize the damage. We stay because staying is the only option that makes any sense." And that's where we are now. Still working for Allegheny Steelworks, still optimizing weapons failures, still contributing to a system that has industrialized human conflict for profit. Not because we believe in what we're doing, but because we've learned that believing in what you do is another luxury that most people can't afford. The Hazelwood facility now operates 3 shifts, producing steel for conflicts that span the globe. We've opened 2 more facilities, one in Ohio, one in Alabama, using techniques we perfected during our original sabotage efforts. Our failure rates are so sophisticated that no government has ever traced weapons malfunctions back to manufacturing defects, which means customer satisfaction remains high even as replacement sales continue to grow. Sometimes I receive updates on conflicts where our steel is being used, usually just statistical summaries, casualty rates, ammunition consumption, equipment replacement schedules. Occasionally, I get more detailed reports about specific incidents where our sabotaged weapons performed exactly as designed. Last month, I learned about a tank in Yemen whose armor failed during an ambush, killing the crew, but not before they managed to call in airstrikes that destroyed a hospital. The week before that, I read about artillery shells in Syria that exploded prematurely, killing the gunners but also sending shrapnel into a nearby school. These weren't failures of our system. These were successes. Our sabotage had worked exactly as intended, creating unpredictable casualties that served Alleghany's business model while maintaining plausible deniability about the source of weapons malfunctions. And tomorrow, I'll go back to work. I'll review production schedules, analyze failure patterns, and coordinate with field operatives who collect data on how our sabotaged weapons perform in actual combat. I'll attend meetings where we discuss quarterly targets and annual projections. I'll train new employees in techniques that turn moral rebellion into corporate profit. Not because I want to, not because I believe in what I'm doing, but because I've learned that in a world where evil is industrialized, competent participation in evil systems is sometimes the only way to prevent those systems from becoming even more evil than they already are. The steel betrayer isn't my father, who spent 40 years perfecting weapons while telling himself he was just doing his job. The steel betrayer isn't Alleghany Steel Works, which has turned human conflict into a sustainable business model. The steel betrayer is me, the person who learned the truth about how the world really works, tried to fight it, failed catastrophically, and then accepted employment with the enemy because accepting employment was easier than living with the consequences of resistance. I betrayed the steel by trying to make it fail. The steel betrayed me by making my failure succeed. And now we're all trapped in a system where betrayal has become just another form of collaboration, where moral action has become a market optimization strategy, where the attempt to fight evil has become the most sophisticated form of evil ever devised. There's no escape. There's no resolution. There's no moment where justice triumphs or evil is defeated or anyone learns a lesson that makes any of this worthwhile. There's just this spiral, downward, always downward, into deeper complicity, greater compromise, more sophisticated forms of moral failure. And the worst part is that it works. The weapons fail when they're supposed to fail, the conflicts continue for exactly as long as they're supposed to continue, and the steel flows from Pittsburgh to battlefields around the world in an endless stream of profitable death. The system is perfect, which means we're all perfectly trapped inside it. Forever. Look, I know this story was heavy. It wasn't meant to make you feel good. But if you made it to the end, if you sat through this spiral of moral decay and stayed, then you understand something most people never will. That the world isn't broken because of monsters. It's broken because systems turn good people into tools and then make them grateful for it. And if that hit you, if it made you uncomfortable, if it made you question what you thought you knew, then you're exactly who I need watching these videos. Not because you're looking for hope, but because you're willing to stare into the machinery and still not look away. So, subscribe. Not out of enjoyment, but because stories like this matter, and most people will never hear them unless someone like you helps carry them forward. Leave a comment. What would you have done differently? But be honest, whatever you say, the system already knows how to weaponize it. Because the real question isn't whether you choose differently than these characters. It's whether you'd even realize you were choosing it all.